The bells began before anyone saw the flames. No, church bells calling for prayer. Alarm bells, ringing fast, uneven, desperate. A woman screamed somewhere near the Rue Saint-Paul. The wind answered first, sharp, dry, rushing through wooden beams and narrow streets, like it had been waiting for this moment. Then the fire revealed itself. No small, no hesitant. It climbed. Orange light burst through the upper windows of a merchant's home. Sparks leapt across rooftops as if the sky itself had caught. Montreal, the 10th of April, 1734. The city did not burn slowly. It ignited. Men ran with buckets that felt too small. Snowmelt water sloshed uselessly against walls already devoured by flame. Horses broke loose from stables, eyes wide, nostrils flared, hooves striking, cobblestone in blind panic. The wind turned accomplice. Wooden houses pressed tightly along narrow streets fed each other. Fire leapt from roof to roof, racing faster than any man could shout orders. A storehouse collapsed first, then another. Smoke thickened into something that choked the air, carrying with it the smell of pine beams, tar, wool, parchment, the smell of a city being undone. Someone cried that it was spreading toward the Hotel. Someone else swore it had started inside a house belonging to a widow. But in moments like this, details do not matter. Only survival does. By midnight, nearly a quarter of Montreal lay in ruin. 46 buildings reduced to embers, warehouses, homes, livelihoods. The colonial settlement that prided itself on order now stood lit from beneath by chaos. Let this image settle, a frontier city carved from forest, wood everywhere, fire everywhere, and no clear beginning, because that is the part history always wants, a beginning, something simple, something explainable, something that can be blamed. By morning, the smoke drifted low and heavy over the St. Lawrence River. Ash settled onto shoulders and hair. People walked through blackened streets with stunned faces, counting what remained. And slowly, quietly, the question emerged. Who did this? No, what caused it? Who? There were whispers before there was evidence, whispers about a woman, an enslaved woman, a housekeeper. Her name had been heard in the days before, connected to unrest, to tension inside her employer's home. But until the fire, she was just another figure moving quietly inside colonial Montreal. No, she became something else. Angelique. They did not yet call her the city burner. That name would harden later. At first it was suspicion. Someone claimed to have seen her carrying coals. Someone else said she had argued with her mistress. Another insisted she had threatened to burn the house. Memory rearranges itself quickly after catastrophe. The human mind hates emptiness. It fills gaps. And Montreal had a gap wide enough to swallow streets. Here is something that matters. There was no forensic science in 1734. No arson investigators tracing burn patterns. No chemical analysis. There were only witnesses, and witnesses are fragile things in moments of fear. The fire had spread too quickly for certainty. Chimneys in early colonial cities were notorious hazards. One stray spark in dry spring air could become disaster, but disaster rarely satisfies on its own. Colonial societies built on hierarchy need agency behind catastrophe. They need intention, and intention needs a face. By afternoon, that face was hers. She was taken into custody swiftly, too swiftly. Some later historians would argue before a formal investigation had fully unfolded. Angelique was detained. A city grieving its loss does not wait long when a convenient explanation appears. Picture her in that moment, the smoke still lingering, the streets blackened, and inside a holding cell, An enslaved woman suddenly transformed from domestic worker to accused arsonist. The fire still smoldered in parts of Montreal when her name began circulating with certainty. Angelique burned the city. The sentence moved faster than proof, because the alternative was unbearable. If the fire had been accidental, the result of faulty chimneys or careless construction, then the disaster was random, uncontrollable. If, however, it had been deliberate, then it could be contained, punished, closed. And what better containment than the body of someone already bound by law? The flames that consumed Montreal had not yet cooled, but already another fire had begun, one that would burn far longer, and this time it would not devour buildings. It would devour a woman. We will step into that fire next. They did not bring her through the main square. No, at first. When Joseph Angélique was taken into custody, the smoke from the Great Fire of Montreal still lingered in the air. The charred beams had not yet been cleared. Ash clung to hems and boots. City was raw, and inside that rawness they moved quickly. She was not arrested as a neighbor, no, as a citizen. She was arrested as property. That distinction shaped everything. Angelique had been enslaved in New France for years by the widow of François Paulin de Francheville. Domestic slavery in 5th century Montreal did not look like plantation slavery in the Caribbean. It was quieter, more intimate. Enslaved people worked inside homes, cooking, cleaning, hauling water, tending fires. Fires, it is difficult not to notice the irony. She knew the house from the inside, the rooms, the stairways, the storage spaces, the placement of embers at night. Domestic servants understood architecture better than many of the men who owned the men. Buildings, that proximity would soon be interpreted as access. But before the fire, she had a life defined not by flame, but by confinement. She had been born in Portugal's Atlantic slave network, likely of African origin, and brought into French colonial society as movable property. In New France, slavery existed, but was often minimized in later national memory, yet by the early turf years, hundreds of enslaved Africans and indigenous people lived in the colony. Angelique was one of them. Her daily world would have been narrow, floors to scrub, meals to prepare, wood to carry, commands to obey. Montreal was not large. Its social structure was tight. News traveled quickly. So did rumor, and in the weeks before the fire, rumor had already begun circling her name. She had tried to escape, no, alone with a white indentured servant named Claude Thibault. That detail matters because it complicates the narrative that would later paint her as a lone, vengeful arsonist, an enslaved black woman attempting escape with a white servant, unsettled colonial order more deeply than flame ever could. It blurred hierarchy. It suggested alliance across status lines. When authorities caught them, Thibault fled again. Angelique did not make it far. She returned to the Francheville household under greater scrutiny. Imagine that return. The mistress watching more closely, the tension in small rooms, the knowledge that you had tried to leave and failed. In slave societies, attempted escape is more than disobedience. It is declaration. It says, I do not accept this condition. That declaration lingers. And when the fire came weeks later, the memory of that attempt sat waiting. Some witnesses would later testify that Angelique had threatened to burn the house before, that she had spoken in anger, that she had warned her mistress. But testimony after disaster often rearranges itself to fit the outcome. The fire had devastated nearly a quarter of Montreal, 46 buildings lost, warehouses, homes, livelihoods. The colony needed explanation, and here stood a woman who had already signaled defiance. Let me ask something carefully. When catastrophe strikes, who is more vulnerable to suspicion? the obedient or the already marked. Angelique was marked by her status, by her attempted escape, by her temper, as some described it, by her refusal to remain invisible. As she sat in custody, the narrative around her solidified rapidly. No, through physical evidence, there was none documented clearly linking her to the origin point of the blaze, but through accumulation of voice. One person said they saw her near the loft with hot coals. Another claimed she carried embers up the stairs. Another recalled heated words exchanged with her mistress days earlier. No one, crucially, saw her ignite the city, but absence of sight does not prevent construction of story. Colonial Montreal was not built to tolerate ambiguity. The settlement was fragile, wooden structures pressed close, wind cutting through narrow streets. If the fire had been accidental, then the city's vulnerability was structural. If it had been deliberate, then vulnerability could be contained inside a single body, and that body was already legally owned. The logic hardened. She had motive. She had opportunity. She had anger. By the time formal proceedings began, Angelique was no longer simply a suspect. She was becoming symbol of rebellion, symbol of disorder, symbol of what enslaved agency might look like if left unchecked. Before we go further into this story, tell me where you're watching from. These histories travel farther when more voices carry them. No, return with me to that holding cell. Because what happens next will not only determine her fate, it will define how Montreal remembers itself. She sat confined while the city rebuilt its language around her. No fire, no accident, no chimney, but arson. And not just arson, rebellion. In French colonial law, the charge was incendie, deliberate burning, a crime punishable by death. But beneath the legal phrasing lay something deeper. A woman who had tried to run now stood accused of trying to destroy. An enslaved housekeeper transformed into the city burner. And yet, the deeper we move into the trial record, the less solid that transformation becomes. Because somewhere between ash and accusation, something else flickered. Doubt. We will step into that next. The night before the fire was not marked in any official calendar. No storm warnings, no military unrest, no documented uprising, just wind. Cold, sharp spring wind pushing through the narrow wooden corridors of Montreal, rattling shutters and slipping under doors. Inside the Frenchville home, routine held, or appeared to. Joseph Angélique moved through her assigned tasks, tending embers, clearing spaces, preparing for morning. Domestic labor does not pause for tension, it absorbs it. And tension was there. Weeks earlier she had tried to flee with Claude Thibault, an indentured white servant. That attempt had failed. He ran again, she was captured and returned. Returned, that word carries weight in a slave society. Returned does not mean forgiven. Returned means watched. Returned means measured, measured differently. Returned means no longer trusted even in routine. The household had not forgotten. Witnesses later described arguments, harsh words, anger, threats. One woman would testify that Angelique declared she would burn the house before being sold south. But testimony given after catastrophe often grows teeth. Here is what we know with certainty. Montreal's buildings in 1734 were tightly packed timber structures. Chimneys were common fire hazards. Open hearths burned constantly. Dry spring air and strong wind create ideal conditions for disaster. The fire, when it came on the 10th of April, spread too quickly for a single small flame to explain. And that is where the story tightens. Because when fire spreads unnaturally fast, people search for unnatural cause. Let me ask something carefully. If a city built from wood burns under dry wind, is that accident or inevitability? But inevitability does not satisfy grief. Grief demands agency, and agency demands a person. The next morning, as smoke still clung to the skyline, accusations began forming shape. A child claimed to have seen her with hot coals in the attic. Another said she had carried embers up the stairs, yet no testimony placed flame in her hand at ignition. No one saw her strike spark. No one watched her set beam alight. Still, by midday, her arrest felt almost preordained, because the narrative had already found its vessel, an enslaved woman who had tried to escape, a housekeeper who knew the structure intimately, a woman described as outspoken. The leap from defiance to destruction required only imagination, and imagination was abundant in a city staring at ruin. No return to the ashes, because something subtle happened between accusation and certainty. The narrative began hardening before evidence solidified. Authorities did not start with forensic analysis. Such science did not exist. They started with character. Angelique had motive. She had been threatened with sale. She had attempted escape. She had quarreled. Those elements combined formed a convenient arc. Fire becomes revenge. Revenge becomes rebellion. Rebellion becomes criminal certainty. But here is the tension historians continue to wrestle with. There were alternative explanations documented quietly in early testimony. Some suggested the blaze may have begun in a neighboring loft. Others hinted at chimney sparks. One witness contradicted another regarding timing. And yet those contradictions did not gain traction, because contradiction complicates closure. Montreal needed closure. 46 buildings gone, economic loss severe, public confidence shaken. To restore order, the colony required a decisive story. Angelique provided narrative clarity, too much clarity. The shift from suspect to symbol happened almost overnight. By the time formal interrogation began, she was no longer merely a domestic worker accused of carelessness. She was framed as incendiary, intentional, calculated, dangerous. The city that burned in hours was rebuilding its certainty far more quickly. But certainty built quickly can crack under pressure, and the deeper we move into the trial records, the more that pressure becomes visible, because when testimony fractures, truth slips through. And what slipped through in 1734 was not flame, but doubt. They questioned her before the city finished counting its losses. The smoke had not fully lifted from the charred beams of Montreal when officials began assembling testimony against Joseph Angélique. That speed matters, because investigation suggests patience. This was not patience. This was containment. She was brought before local authorities in chains, not as a citizen accused of crime, but as enslaved property suspected of destroying property. In French colonial law, enslaved people did not stand on equal ground in court. Their bodies were already defined by ownership. Guilt in such a structure does not need to climb far. The magistrates began gathering depositions. Neighbors, children, servants. Some claimed they saw her near the loft before the blaze. Some insisted she carried coals upstairs. Others said she had spoken angrily in days prior, that she threatened to burn the house rather than be sold. Threats, once spoken, are easy to retrieve after catastrophe. But no witness could testify to seeing her ignite flame. That absence lingered in the record, quietly, almost awkwardly, and yet the machinery did not slow. In early 18th century New France, criminal procedure followed a pattern rooted in French law. There were phases: interrogation, confrontation with witnesses, judgment, but the law also allowed for something else: pressure, because confession was prized above all else. Without confession, doubt remains. With confession, Narrative closes. The city needed closure. 46 buildings gone. Warehouses collapsed. Economic damage significant for a frontier colony. If the fire were accidental, the result of poor chimney construction or stray sparks carried by wind, then the disaster revealed fragility within the colony itself. But if it were deliberate, an act of arson committed by an enslaved woman, then fragility could be explained away as rebellion. Rebellion can be punished, structural weakness cannot. Midway through the depositions, a contradiction surfaced. Some testimony suggested the fire may have started in a neighboring loft before spreading to the Francheville house, a different timeline, a different origin. The contradiction did not disappear from the record, but it did not define it either, because narrative gravity had already shifted toward Angelique. Her earlier attempt to escape with Claude Thibault resurfaced repeatedly during questioning. Her temperament was described as insolent. Her alleged anger was emphasized. Character became evidence, let that sit. When physical proof is thin, personality thickens the case. By the time formal charges were articulated, the language had hardened. Incendie volontaire, voluntary arson. The charge was not negligence. No accident, voluntary destruction. Under French criminal law, arson was a capital offense, punishable by death, but conviction required more than suspicion. It required either 2 eyewitnesses or a confession. There were not 2 clear eyewitnesses to ignition. That left only one path forward, and that path was already common in 18th century jurisprudence: judicial torture. The procedure had a name: la question, applied when evidence was strong but incomplete. It was not considered unlawful, it was considered method. Angelique, still legally enslaved, would be subjected to this process not as extraordinary cruelty, but as ordinary legal practice. Before torture was applied, she was interrogated repeatedly. She denied setting the fire. She denied intention. Her denial did not end proceedings. It intensified them, because a city already convinced of her guilt could not easily accept her silence. The more she refused confession, the more that refusal itself was interpreted as defiance. And defiance had already been associated with her. The shift was subtle but decisive. She was no longer being investigated to determine guilt. She was being pressed to confirm it. Let me leave you with something to hold on to before we move further. If a confession is extracted under pain, what does it truly prove? That question would not matter in 1734 Montreal. But it will matter to us, because what happens next transforms suspicion into certainty, not through new evidence, but through suffering. They brought her into the chamber before dawn. No for spectacle, no for the crowd. This was not yet performance. This was procedure. Under French criminal law in the 18th century, when evidence pointed strongly toward guilt but lacked full certainty, judges were permitted to apply la question, judicial torture, to extract confession. It was not considered barbaric, it was considered clarifying. And in the case of Joseph Angélique, clarification had already been decided in advance. The only missing piece was her voice agreeing to it. She had denied setting the fire repeatedly, denied intent, denied ignition, denied the narrative forming around her. But denial inside a colony still smelling of smoke sounded like resistance, and resistance required force. The chamber was quiet, no crowd, no public fury. Just officials, clerks, instruments. The first stage, question ordinaire, was designed to break resolve without immediate mutilation. She was bound, ropes tightened, limbs stretched. The human body under tension speaks differently. Pain reorganizes thought, but she held, denied again. The record reflects that she did not confess under initial pressure. That detail matters because it complicates the idea of immediate collapse. The escalation followed. Question extraordinaire, more severe, more deliberate. In some French colonies, this involved crushing the legs with wedges, tightening cords until circulation faltered, pouring water to simulate drowning. Montreal's records indicate that she was subjected to extreme leg compression. The body cannot withstand prolonged concentrated force without yielding. Eventually she spoke. A confession emerged, but it did not sound like the narrative already circulating in the streets. She did not describe elaborate planning. She did not detail a city-wide strategy. Instead, she admitted to placing embers in the loft of her mistress's house, not necessarily intending to destroy the entire city. The scale of catastrophe did not match the scale of confession. That gap is where doubt begins to widen, because the Great Fire of Montreal consumed 46 buildings, entire blocks, economic lifelines. If her act was as limited as her confession suggested, how did it become urban devastation, windry timber, tightly packed construction? These factors existed regardless of intent, but confession simplified everything. The city did not need to analyze wind patterns once a name had been secured. Pain had completed the narrative. Here is what shifts in this moment. Before torture, she was accused. After torture, she was confirmed, no because new evidence appeared, but because suffering had aligned her voice with the colony's need. The legal structure required confession to solidify conviction. It received one under duress, and the duress itself was lawful. Let that settle. Justice in Huadi did not consider torture invalidating. It considered it investigative. Angelique's body became instrument. Her pain became proof. The confession was recorded, written into official transcript. From that point forward, the story of the city burner gained weight. Because confession, even coerced, stabilizes narrative. The public would not witness the compression of her legs. They would only hear that she admitted guilt. And once a confession exists on parchment, doubt becomes whisper. But something subtle remains in the trial record. Even under torture, she did not confess to a coordinated plot. She did not name accomplices beyond suggestion of prior tensions. She did not articulate ideological rebellion. The fire's scale exceeded the clarity of her statement. That imbalance lingers because if she set a small fire in anger or desperation, the city's construction amplified it beyond intent. And if the fire began elsewhere and her confession was shaped by pain, then Montreal may have burned twice, once by flame, and once by fear. The court now possessed what it required. Confession, charges would proceed toward sentencing. The public phase was approaching, and public justice in colonial societies was not quiet. It was demonstrative. The city that had burned would soon gather again, this time not to fight flame, but to watch one. By the time the trial moved from interrogation to judgment, the outcome felt inevitable. The confession had been secured. The narrative had stabilized. The city, still rebuilding charred foundations, now needed finality. Inside the courtroom in Montreal, the proceedings unfolded with formal gravity. Clerks recorded statements. Officials read depositions aloud. Witnesses repeated what had already been shaped into loud public memory. Joseph Angélique stood at the center of it, not as a citizen defending herself, but as enslaved property accused of destroying property. That imbalance framed everything. The surviving trial transcripts are remarkably detailed for their time. They preserve names, timelines, witness accounts, and when read carefully, something unsettling emerges. The evidence was circumstantial, No one saw her ignite the blaze. No physical proof tied her to the exact origin point of the fire. Several testimonies contradicted one another on sequence and location. Yet the confession under torture overshadowed those fractures. The court leaned heavily on her alleged admission that she placed embers in the attic of her mistress's house. That act, whether described fully or partially, became the anchor. But here is the contradiction buried within the record. The fire appears to have spread with extraordinary speed, possibly originating elsewhere, before reaching the Francheville home. Some early accounts suggest a neighboring structure may have ignited. First, the wind that night was fierce. Wooden buildings stood shoulder to shoulder. Chimneys were notorious hazards. Those structural realities appear in testimony briefly before being overtaken by focus on Angelique's character. She was described as angry, rebellious, insolent. Her attempted escape resurfaced repeatedly during deliberations. The court was not simply evaluating flame, it was evaluating defiance. And defiance in a slave society carries its own verdict. Let something become clear here. French colonial courts required strong proof for capital punishment. When proof was incomplete, torture supplied confirmation. Once confession was documented, the legal path narrowed sharply. The judges delivered sentence. She would be executed by hanging. Her body would then be burned, a symbolic inversion of the crime. Arson answered by fire. The spectacle mattered. Public execution served two audiences: the white colonists, who needed reassurance that order had been restored; the enslaved population, who needed warning that rebellion would be annihilated. But even in the sentencing phase, doubt flickers quietly, because while the court declared her sole perpetrator, the scale of destruction remained difficult to reconcile with a single act of ember placement. The fire had destroyed 46 buildings. Economic loss was severe. Was one woman's act sufficient explanation, or did the city's fragile amplify a smaller incident into catastrophe? The trial did not pursue that question deeply. It did not need to. Closure had already been chosen. There was one more procedural step. Under French law, condemned prisoners could appeal to the Sovereign Council, the highest court in New France. Angelique's case moved upward, and for a moment possibility reopened. The Sovereign Council reviewed the record. They reduced the brutality of her sentence slightly, removing the initial planned torture before execution, but upheld the conviction. The verdict stood. The narrative solidified. She would hang, then burn. The city that had ignited in wind and timber would now ignite again, deliberately, publicly. As punishment, the courtroom emptied. The date was set. Outside, Montreal continued rebuilding its homes. Inside, it had already rebuilt its certainty. The fire now had a name, and that name would be carried to the Tuileries scaffold. They chose a public square, no hidden behind prison walls, no in some narrow alley away from sight. The execution of Joseph Angélique would take place where Montreal could see it, because the city that had burned needed to witness restoration. The scaffold rose above the crowd like a second structure, replacing those lost to flame. Timber beams assembled carefully, rope measured, officials in position, soldiers standing near enough, signal control. The air carried a different tension than the night of the fire, no panic expectation. The trial had concluded, the confession recorded, the Sovereign Council had upheld the sentence. The colony had spoken. No, it would demonstrate. Angelique was brought forward under guard. She had endured interrogation. She had endured torture. She had endured weeks inside confinement while the city rebuilt its narrative around her name. No, she would endure spectacle. Her sentence required hanging first. After death, Her body would be burned, symbolic completion of justice for incendi. The gathered crowd included merchants who had lost warehouses, families displaced from homes, laborers who had helped clear rubble. For them, this was not abstract law. It was compensation in ritual form. If the fire had destabilized confidence, this execution was meant to restore it. Let us be precise. Public execution in 18th century New France was theater of authority. It did not simply punish the individual, it reaffirmed the hierarchy. An enslaved woman accused of destroying property would be destroyed in return, order rebalanced through display. As she stood beneath the scaffold, no surviving transcript preserves a final speech. Some accounts suggest she maintained innocence to the end. Others suggest resignation. Silence fills the gap. The rope was placed, the drop calculated, the body fell. Execution by hanging was meant to be swift. The crowd did not erupt, they watched, the body stilled. But the sentence did not end there. After death, her body was burned. The fire was not accidental this time. It was deliberate. Officials ensured the flame was visible. The symbolism was unmistakable. You burned the city. The city burns you. Ash rising against sky once blackened weeks earlier. And in that moment, something settled across Montreal. No peace closure. Closure is quieter than peace. The city had its culprit, the narrative now complete. An enslaved housekeeper, angry and defiant, set fire in revenge. Justice answered. Yet even within the spectacle, ambiguity remained. Because execution resolves legal guilt, not historical certainty. The speed of her arrest, the reliance on confession extracted under torture, the contradictions in witness testimony, the architectural vulnerability of a wooden frontier town, none of those complexities burned away with her body. They remained embedded in the trial transcript, embedded in the questions later historians would ask. But on that day, none of that mattered. The spectacle was effective. Montreal had endured catastrophe. Montreal had punished cause. The smoke rose again, thinner than the night of the 10th of April, but intentional. This fire did not spread to rooftops. It rose straight upward, controlled, contained. The colony could point to it and say, order restored. Yet something else had been ignited, a story. And stories, once formed around catastrophe, travel further than flame. In the years that followed, Angelique's name did not disappear. It hardened. She became the woman who burned Montreal, the city burner, the enslaved housekeeper who destroyed 46 buildings. But history does not remain still. And as generations passed, scholars would reopen the transcript. They would re-examine contradictions. They would question the confession. They would reconsider the architecture of fear that surrounded the trial. The fire that consumed her body ended in ash. The fire around her name did not. It smoldered, waiting to be touched again. We will return to those embers next. The flames died in 1734. The verdict did not. For nearly 2 centuries, Marie-Joseph Angélique existed in Montreal's memory as fact, not question. She burned the city. It was stated plainly, repeated in local histories, folded into narrative shorthand. A single enslaved woman driven by anger reduced 46 buildings in Montreal to ash. Case closed. But history does not remain static forever. It waits for someone willing to read more closely. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, scholars began returning to the trial transcripts. No as confirmation, but as investigation. One of the most influential voices in this re-examination was historian Afua Cooper, who studied the surviving court records line by line, and what she found was not certainty. It was instability. The testimonies conflicted. Witnesses disagreed on timing. Some accounts suggested the fire may have begun elsewhere before spreading to the Francheville home. Others described events after the blaze was already underway. The confession, extracted under torture, did not describe an intent to destroy an entire city. It described placing embers in an attic. The scale of devastation exceeded the scale of that admission. And suddenly, the narrative that once seemed solid began to shift. Let something important be clear. Re-examining Angelique's case is not about romanticizing arson. It is about interrogating the structure of accusation. Montreal in 1734 was a colonial settlement built from timber, crowded tightly, vulnerable to wind-driven flame. Chimneys were common ignition points. Fires in wooden frontier towns were frequent, often catastrophic. That context was minimized once a culprit was named. Because naming her simplified complexity, scholars began asking what the court did not fully pursue. What if the fire began accidentally? What if structural weakness, not sabotage, was primary? What if Angelique's attempted escape made her the most convenient explanation? Here is where the myth fractures the city burner. Narrative presumes deliberate destruction on massive scale, but the trial record does not conclusively prove that scale of intent. The colony may have transformed a localized act, or even an accident, into symbolic rebellion, and that transformation tells us something about fear. Enslaved people in New France were few compared to Caribbean colonies, but their presence unsettled the colonial self-image of order. Slavery in Canada is often minimized in national memory, yet its side existed. It shaped households, it shaped law. Angelique's trial exposes that reality starkly. An enslaved woman accused of incendiary was not judged in neutral environment. She was judged inside a society that depended on hierarchy and feared disruption. When catastrophe struck, that fear sought shape. Her body became it. One powerful dilemma surfaces here. If a society built on bondage faces disaster, does it investigate structure or punish defiance? Montreal chose the latter. But centuries later, historians reopened the structure. They found a case built heavily on character, confession under torture, and public anxiety. They found a narrative that may have exaggerated agency to avoid confronting fragility. This does not mean she was innocent. It means the certainty of her guilt was never as stable as memory claimed. That distinction matters, because historical myths often harden around emotional need. Montreal needed an explanation. It needed closure. It needed a person to hold accountable for devastation. And once that need was fulfilled, the story settled, until someone disturbed it. Modern scholarship does not replace one myth with another. It introduces doubt where certainty once stood. It reframes Angelique not simply as arsonist, but as enslaved woman navigating confinement, surveillance, attempted escape, and colonial suspicion. Her execution remains documented fact. The fire remains documented fact. What shifts is interpretation. The city that once burned her body now debates her narrative. Public memory in Montreal has evolved. Plays have been written, books published, her name invoked not as simple villain, but as contested figure in Canada's history of slavery. The question is no longer only did she burn the city, it becomes why was it so important that she did? Because when a community anchors catastrophe to a marginalized body, it reveals more about its anxieties than its evidence. The ash from 1734 has long settled, but the transcript remains. And in those pages between testimony and torture, between accusation and execution, history flickers differently. No extinguished, no resolved, but open. We will return once more to the fire, not as spectacle, but as mirror. The fire began with wind. That is how we first saw it. Wooden roofs catching, sparks leaping street to street, the settlement of Montreal glowing against the night, like something deliberate, something chosen. In that first image there was no courtroom, no transcript, no rope, only flame and fear, no return to that same fire. But see what stands behind it. A frontier town built almost entirely of timber, chimneys imperfect, hearths constantly burning, spring air dry enough to carry a single ember across a street. And inside that town, an enslaved woman who had already tried to leave, Joseph Angélique. The narrative that survived for centuries is simple. She burned the city. But simplicity is often the product of necessity. Montreal in 1734 needed clarity more than complexity. 46 buildings destroyed, economic confidence shaken. A colony dependent on hierarchy facing visible vulnerability. If the fire was accidental, then the disaster exposed weakness in construction, planning, and oversight. If the fire was deliberate, then the weakness could be contained in a single body, and that body could be punished. The trial transcripts remain. They show contradiction. They show testimony built on memory after catastrophe. They show confession extracted under torture. They show a sentence delivered with finality. What they do not show is forensic certainty. The story hardened anyway. For generations, Angelique became the answer, the enslaved housekeeper who burned Montreal. The city burner, her execution became proof that order had prevailed. But history is not static. When scholars reopened the case, they did not erase the fire, they reframed it. They asked whether structural vulnerability played larger role. They asked whether colonial fear accelerated accusation. They asked whether her attempted escape made her the easiest explanation. And slowly the narrative shifted from certainty to tension. She is not easily redeemed into hero, no easily confined to villain. She exists in the space between, an enslaved woman navigating confinement, a colony navigating fragility, a disaster that demanded explanation. The question that remains is not only whether she placed embers in an attic, it is why the colony needed her to have done so. Because in slave societies, catastrophe threatens more than property. It threatens the illusion of control. If flame spreads without intention, then power is fragile. If flame spreads through rebellion, then power can reassert itself through punishment. Montreal chose the second explanation. It burned her body to stabilize the first. Return once more to the image of the fire. Roofs collapsing, smoke climbing, people running through streets illuminated by orange light. No, overlay that image with another. A scaffold, a rope, a body burned deliberately to answer destruction. Two fires, one uncontrolled, one controlled. One accidental or deliberate, we cannot know with certainty. One absolutely intentional, that is the inversion history leaves us with. The Great Fire of Tauvin reshaped the city's streets. The execution reshaped its narrative. Today, Angélique's name circulates not as unquestioned fact, but as debate, as reminder that slavery existed in Canada, as reminder that colonial justice operated under different standards, as reminder that disaster often seeks a face. If a society built on bondage faces catastrophe, who becomes the most convenient explanation? That is the moral weight this story carries. No, a clean resolution. No, a hero's arc. No, a villain's legend, but a mirror. The fire we opened with still burns, not in timber, but in interpretation. And interpretation is harder to extinguish than flame. If this story unsettled you, sit with that. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what you believe. Was Angélique the deliberate city burner, or was she the colony's answer to its own vulnerability? Share this episode so more people can confront the parts of history that were simplified, buried, or rewritten. And subscribe to Unrecorded Histories They Tried to Bury, because there are more names waiting inside the smoke.